The official campaign period for the June 3rd local elections come to an end at midnight tonight, bringing 13 days of campaigning to a close. For more on what to expect at this year's elections, we're joined today by An Junseong, an attorney in South Korea. Thanks for coming on today.
Good morning.
So early voting for the local elections saw a record turnout this year of more than 23%. Both parties are interpreting the high turnout very differently. How could the strong early voting turnout affect the outcome of this year's election?
Yes, the record high early voting turnout is politically significant, but it should not be read as the indicator of a victory for either side. In most cases, high early turnout reflects intensity rather than a direction, which means that it tells us voters are engaged, not necessarily who they support. So both camps are likely engaged in selective interpretation, like, as you said, framing the data as evidence of their own momentum. But analytically, the deciding factor is the composition rather than the volume by itself, which democratic and political groups actually turn out early. So unless we see a corresponding surge in the election day turnout or clear asymmetry in the voter composition, early voting figures alone are unlikely to determine the outcome.
I see. And local elections have traditionally seen lower voter turnout than presidential elections. What factors do you think contributed to this year's record high early voting turnout, and could it actually lead to higher turnout on the actual election day?
This year's early voting surge reflects a combination of structural and political factors. Structurally, the early voting has become normalized in South Korea's electoral culture, reducing the barrier to participation. Politically, heightened polarization and competitive local races have increased the perceived stakes, pushing both parties to mobilize supporters earlier than usual. However, there is a critical distinction between timing and total participation. Early voting often redistributes turnout rather than expanding it. So whether it translates into higher overall turnout will depends on whether political engagement remains elevated through the election day, particularly among the marginal or undecided voters.
I see. And rival parties also clashed after President Lee encouraged people to vote in the local elections. What do you make of this controversy? Was it a routine call for civic participation, or could it be viewed as politically charged?
Well, generally speaking, the encouraging voter participation is consistent with the democratic norms and is not unusual in itself. However, in a highly polarized environment, the interpretation of such statements becomes inherently political. So it depends on how you see it. So supporters tend to frame it as a standard civic message, while the opponent interprets it through the partisan lens, especially when delivered by a sitting president who is inevitably embedded in the ongoing political competition. In that sense, the controversy is less about content of the message. Is more about context, which is delivered. So in other words, neutrality is difficult to claim when the institutional authority intersects with electoral stakes.
I see. And early voting increased very sharply in several key battleground regions. Which area should we be watching most closely on election night, and why?
I think attention should focus on comparative swinging region, right? Swinging region where the margins are historically narrow and electoral volatility is high. Key area includes the Busan and some districts in the Greater Seoul and Gyeonggi region. These areas often function as the key indicators for national political sentiment. In addition, unusually high early voting increase in specific regions, particularly those showing deviation from past pattern, should be closely monitored. And this shift may signal either effective mobilization or underlining change in voter alignment. Ultimately, these battlegrounds will likely determine the narrative of election before the final national aggregates are fully counted.
All right, you just mentioned Busan, and former presidents were seen joining campaign efforts in battleground regions like Busan, you mentioned, and Daegu. Could their involvement influence undecided voters or affect the outcome of key races?
Yeah, so I think this is kind of the double-edged sword situation. I think that the involvement of a former president adds symbolic weight to the campaigns, particularly in the region like Busan and Daegu, where the partisan identity remains strong. But their influence is primarily organizational and effective. They can means that energize core supporters and reinforce party identity. However, this persuasive power over the undecided voter is more limited in today's issue-driven electoral environment. In tightened contested races, even marginal effect on turnout or enthusiasm can be matter. But it would be an overstatement to suggest that a former president are decisive actors shaping the overall electoral outcome today. Their role is better understood as amplifying existing political dynamics rather than transforming them. So there's very limited role they play for the election.
I see, I see. We'll have to see how that goes. All right, thank you so much for your time and insight today, Mr. An. We appreciate it.
Thank you.